welcome back to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend Charles.
Yes, I am ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, but not just any fantasy today, because today we are talking about one of the hottest books to print today. Relatively
Nice.
new release, came out, just a month ago at the time of this recording, not even. A book by a friend of the show and an author who we have discussed multiple times. We've read two of his series and discussed them on the show. I'm, of course, referring to best-selling author Mark Lawrence and his newest release, The Book That Wouldn't Burn, book one of the Library trilogy.
Charles, did you call it one of the hottest books on purpose?
Yes, it's hot, but it won't burn.
Yeah, that's one of the benefits. Although when I post about it on Twitter, I believe I was reading it at the pool, and Mark dared me to skip my Kindle across the pool, despite your warnings on Twitter, Charles, that it is not the book that wouldn't get waterlogged.
Yes.
But then another person chimed in saying that Kindles can survive X amount of time under
some waterproofing,
Y amount of feet of water. I did not end up trying to skip my book across the pool, but thanks to everyone who suggested it, and I'll have plenty more pool days hopefully
it definitely
this
seemed
summer
like
to try.
a lot of the audience had these intrusive thoughts of just chuck that in there, whatever it was about the post, you were really bringing out people's destroy it.
Yeah, I definitely did.
Even the author was calling for it. I think he just wanted you to destroy it so you had to buy a new copy. I think that was
I think
probably
I'd have
the motivation
to just
there.
get a new Kindle and it would already be on there.
Sync to your
as a a former rocket scientist, I think literal rocket scientist, I think Mark would have deduced that. But it's it may not be the book that wouldn't drown, but it is the book that wouldn't burn. And Charles, we had a delightful time reading it. Like you said, it's relatively new release, so your chance, dear listener, to go buy it and be on the cutting edge of fantasy. And we're also gonna get into a lot of spoiler-free talk to start off, which is always a good thing for us to do when it's a new book, and probably lots of folks haven't had the time to read it just yet. But when we love a book like we did with this one, we want to make sure we provide those of you who have not read it with some info about it, and to put our motives out there. We love a book. We want you to read it. So that's going to be some of this as well.
Well said, Dylan. The beginning of this will be spoiler free, and that is to give you all a chance to read it. I heard from Mark himself actually that this book is commercially doing very well. One of his best debuts so far. He mentioned that he's had at least one book a year published since 2011, which, that's an incredible feat. And this one is the first to get a reprint in hardcover, and it's on its fourth printing in the US just 16 days after launch. So Mark has always been relatively transparent about the economy of book retail and things like that.
Blog posts about that.
So this is just another thing where he's like, this is unusual and this is a very good thing, and he's it's very exciting. So we're super happy for him. This is well deserved for sure. And just to set this off on the right spot, not only do we like it, but it is also selling very well also. So our opinion is not that rare. The proof is in the performance.
There's some sort of joke I'm not clever enough to play off of where you call it rare. There's also rare steaks, right? And they're not very burnt. So
You know,
there's something there, Charles. I'm just not quick enough
this
for it.
book
Yeah,
is, red hot, flying off the shelves. I don't know, but
sure.
you know,
Anyway,
I, that meme where there's the dog in the fire and he's like, "This is fine." You know that
yes.
meme? There's someone did the meme where they just put the cover of the book that wouldn't burn over the dog. So it's in the fire and he's like, "This is fine." And I thought that was hilarious because it would be fine because it's the book that wouldn't burn, A little meta joke there that I just
Yeah.
explained verbally that I'm sure was a treat for everyone.
There's nothing funnier than fully explaining a joke, Charles.
And a
And
visual joke at that.
a
So
visual joke in an audio medium. That's what the people are here for. And
that's what the people are here
enjoy
for.
this.
They're
Yeah, but
also
it
here
sounds like
for our thoughts on the book. So Dylan, why don't you get us started?
yeah. Well, I also want to say, I guess there's a lot of folks who will enjoy the second half of this episode, which will get into more of the spoiler
Hmm.
territory, because I guess a lot of folks have had the chance to go out, buy it,
Yes.
and I'm sure read it by now, and we're very excited about that.
Yes.
But
And there is
we'll
stuff we
start.
want to talk about, have to talk
Yes,
about, that is super spoilery. So we are going to save that.
we will, and I'll give you my patented, not really,
Ooh.
spoiler warning at
We
some
should
point
patent
during
it.
this
That way
episode.
you have the patent for spoiler warnings.
I don't think I'm ready to go through whatever process. Maybe we could like trademark turn this down in your headphones.
We could
Maybe.
probably trademark your phrase of turning of
Yeah.
like spoiler warning, turn this down, that kind of thing. I think you're right. I think we could do that. Would be more probable to succeed, but
Yes.
who knows? You never know.
Yeah.
But
All right.
we're here today. Book that wouldn't burn. Mark Lawrence's latest debut. We're no stranger to Mark. We've read a bunch of his work. Um, we've talked about The Prince of Thorns on the show. We did the whole Book of the Ancestor trilogy, starting with Red Sister on this show. And then, Dylan, you've gone and read a couple other series outside of that as
Mm-hmm.
well. So we've also had the privilege of interviewing Mark on the show not that long ago in anticipation of this book's release. And so we're really, what's interesting to us is coming in and seeing like, okay, this guy's released a book a year since 2011. Like this is his latest book, 2023. How, like, what's made this book so successful and like what makes it so successful in the large library of Mark Lawrence's
Nice.
release. Dylan, what, yes, thank you. What do you think is the key to the like the recipe for success here?
Yeah. Well, the more boring version of this answer, which I think I'll lead with, and I also think there's like specific things about this book, but I think it's just Mark's consistency, both in his release schedule
Mm-hmm.
and the quality of his books. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
think people have come to know, hey, if Mark is publishing a book, we know it's going to be good. And
Right.
that's, I know, like a very boring answer. Like, Mark writes good books and people want to read them. And now it's been a long time of Mark writing good books, and he wrote another book, so people want to read it. So
Right.
I mean, like that's part of the answer for sure. As to the book that wouldn't burn in particular, I think you see Mark going into like exploring a lot of these ideas in a way that maybe he wasn't emphasizing as much in like you think of Prince of Thorns, which we talked about his debut. I think that was just I mean he wrote that not even really wanting to publish it, and then it was very like action packed and very fun, I would say. Obviously there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of dark stuff in it, but I would say there's a lot of like really entertaining fun stuff in it that takes the front seat. It's not exploring ideas at the level of the book that wouldn't burn. Well, the book that wouldn't burn, it sounds like it's sitting at a crossroads of like we still have this fun entertaining stuff. I know Mark was on the episode, he was like, hey, this is still going to have your explosions and your fights and those kind of things, but
Hmm.
also going to get into the idea of like, what does it mean when you have access to all of this information, this giant library, and also
Right.
exploring these ideas of, I mean, we won't get into any spoilers around it, but like discrimination and xenophobia and that kind of stuff, which is super relevant to our times and on people's minds. I think Mark, you know he's gonna deliver an entertaining book. That's
Hmm.
for sure. And I think you're bringing in some of these people who are looking for some of those capital L literature themes to be present too. And I think
Hmm.
it delivers on both of those, which is a really hard balance. It's a very tight what do they call it? Like a hard line to walk. It's
Hmm.
not easy, but Mark pulls it off,
Hmm.
and the reviews have been rave reviews, including ours. So
Right.
uh,
Right.
I, I'm not surprised that people are A, enjoying this, and B, buying this a lot.
I agree completely. Like with the book that wouldn't burn, you get everything that Mark Lawrence is noted for, which is a really interesting setting with some kind of sci-fi elements built into it. You get a really unique main character. You get those action points, but where this book kind of breaks off is that Mark Lawrence deliberately kind of delves into more of his thematic development. I'd say more so than any other book that he's written that I've read of his in the past. And certainly he's always got these strong themes of, you know, friendship and violence and like knowledge and like you can like the cost of pursuing knowledge or having too much knowledge and things like that. He's you know he's is a scientist mathematician by trade, so a lot of that is really well woven into his themes. And then now here's a story about knowledge. The setting is a library where all like more knowledge than the people today even are aware that exists is kept in this library, and what that means for society and how it's controlled and how it's like shared and how it's understood and used. And it just allows him to explore a lot more of these complex themes. He weaves in a in a romance, I'll say, that which is goes a little deeper. Like he's always written really interesting romances, but this one I think he spends a lot of time on and challenges in a lot of ways more than he's done in the
Mhm.
past too. So I think a lot of that is how this book is just kind of one on the momentum of being just a consistently talented like hit releasing author, and then also it's like, hey, this one, like I'm taking some extra time in the like what we always call the capital L literature elements, and that I guess was his, you know, secret recipe for success with the book that wouldn't burn.
That's well said, Charles. And I like what you're getting at with these themes around having all this information that all tells kind of different sides of a story. And I think in today's day and age where you can find pretty much like information, be it accurate or not, on the internet that supports
Right.
any sort of view or any way
Right.
of
Right.
seeing just about any issue. Mark dives into that to some extent with this idea of a giant library with a preposterous amount of information where whatever story you want to tell about the past, about things that are currently going on in society or what have you, you can find a book that
Right.
supports that because there's so many, and you
Right.
can. It's interesting to think there's some themes of histories written by the winner, but also like histories written by whoever is deciding to interpret the thing at this moment, and
Right.
it's definitely going to be different depending on who the reader is. It's kind of he raises a lot of those questions. Those are extremely
Yeah.
hard questions to answer, but he explores them in interesting ways, and I'm sure he'll only continue to explore them as he moves forward. And you also
Sure.
mentioned the idea of war, and I think the the way that he dives into that, especially when you think about some of his other books, which center around war, I think this is getting into the yeah, those capital L themes about like let's explore what is even the purpose of war, like why does it happen, is it doomed to always happen, all that kind of stuff that
Right.
I mean, even though Jorg had the occasional like Aristotle or Socrates quote coming out of him in Prince of Thorns, uh
Right.
he was less interested, I think, in exploring those kind of issues, and we're stuck in his head in a very like first person way. Here
Hmm.
we, we have all these more academic folks thinking bigger picture about the concepts that he's gone into in previous books.
Like exactly. And like you said earlier, where Mark is walking a fine line to both explore these themes and deliver on like this bigger scope of a story. And I think he's able to pull that off because we have both the macro level that we explore these things, where it's like the setting, which is a huge library that contains all the world's knowledge and then some. And it's so big that, they you it's its own environment really. And you would think that, like, oh, a society with all the world's knowledge would be a utopia. This technologically advanced like utopian city. And that's not the case in this world. Like there's a lot of ignorance and poverty and wars brewing at the beginning of this book. So at the macro level, it's super interesting to see how society is built around kind of gatekeeping this knowledge, and how that xenophobia you mentioned, Dylan, and classism and things play right in the beginning of the story. But then you have the micro level as well, with our main character Lavira, who's kind of born on the outside, in the dust, is, growing beans.
Literally.
That's yeah, literally. That's how we meet her. And then she gets introduced to this greater world. She didn't know how to read. She didn't really understand what like a book was or what society was. And then she's going through the process of learning about the library and working as a quote librarian and being part of that world is how the book uh, kind of kicks off. And then the relationships that she builds with her unique perspective as an outsider coming in, and just how she's received in the city and everything like that. You get both sides. And to me, that's, when it comes to walking that line, like you mentioned, it's really what sells the book. And why people, I think a lot of reviewers are like, oh, Mark Lawrence's themes in this book are so good. And I think that's the main reason why he's able to hit both levels, the personal and the societal setting versions as well.
For sure. When it comes to fiction, at least the way I read it, if you can't really get into those themes through the plight of the characters at that more micro level in a way that builds empathy for those who are dealing with whatever sorts of conflicts or issues are relevant to the theme, then you're not going to be able to get me to care about it. It's
Right.
very difficult in fiction to get people, or at least me, to care when the characters aren't like going through those kind of things in a very relatable way. And he does that so well through Lavira. He also has the other point of view character that gets, I would estimate, somewhere from like 30 to 40% of the screen time in terms of like his point of view chapters. I definitely think
Yeah.
Lavira gets more, but he gets
Yeah.
a hefty percentage. And I would say, yeah, Ivar represents, a totally different sort of ignorance from Lavira, where he has all of this knowledge in terms of, it's like the street smarts versus book smarts, right? Lavira grew up
Right.
in the dust, and she's learned all these like things that you need to do in order to survive. And then Ivar is trapped in the library, and he has access to all of this book smart inducing information there. But there's points where you realize he's kind of doesn't know a lot because he has
Right.
no real world experience.
Right. All
And
his
I,
memories are being trapped in the library, so
yes,
it's
that
like
too.
there's that
Literally
element.
lacking experiences, even the ones he's had. So it's it is interesting. You have those kind of opposites in those two characters, and also represents something that I think we've never seen before from Mark Lawrence, at least in what I've read. I've read just about almost everything. Uh, um, we I don't think I've ever gotten such a clear like second main character in terms of like rotating
Mm,
point of view
yeah,
in any of his works because I
that's well said.
it seems like something that would have happened before because we've read because he's written a lot of books,
Right.
but yeah, I don't think so. Like, I'm sure we've gotten other point of views. I'm kind of even like I'm remembering like a Abbess class point of view and uh, in the Book of the Ancestor trilogy and
Right.
stuff, but it's very clearly like that's Nona, who is the point of view character.
Right.
And there's a mile between her and whatever
Right.
second
We're as close
point
to
of view
having
there is,
two
where,
main characters as
yeah.
ever before with this one in Mark Lawrence's work. That's actually an interesting observation. You're totally right. I didn't really put that together, but yeah. And
And
I'll
that's a good
say,
sign that you didn't notice because
oh
it
yeah.
means it happened seamlessly. You
Oh,
like Mark did it
well,
well, where you didn't
right.
even
I liked the
question,
way
like,
that
oh,
it
he's
was
only.
set up, where it's almost half and half between Lavira and Eva. I'm sure Lavira kind of, creeps ahead a little bit, but it's close to half and half. And that was one of the things I wanted to say in the spoiler free section was, we had talked about the setting and the library, and some of like Mark Lawrence's sci-fi mathematician influences into the story. I would say about a lot of those stuff that he's all the worlds he's built in the past and the magic systems he's built in the past. I would say that this one to me was one of the most challenging to
Mhm.
grapple with and understand. And one of the things I wanted to say that I was noting while I was reading was how much I appreciated the lengths he would go to explain and re-explain things. One of the things that helped is he'll change perspectives from Lavira to Ivar, and it kind of is like he'll get this segment of the scene that kind of overlaps. So Lavira's scene will end, and then Ivar's will start like slightly before where Lavira's ended. So you get that same scene from both perspectives. And it kind of re-explains some of the more complicated stuff, but it also kind of gave you the other person's perspective at the same time. You could really get the impression that this was an experienced author that, took on a much more complicated idea and was still able to use the tools that he had to communicate it more effectively. And I think one of your observations of them being more 50-50 than any of his previous works, I think a lot of that is supported in this idea of how can we get across these ideas, these complicated ideas, without the reader being like, this is confusing, man. This is a bit ambitious for me as a reader. And I found myself skirting that line a couple times, where I'm like, whoa, whoa, there's like twists and turns happening. You're like, do I fully understand like the workings of the library right now to appreciate this? It gets a little timey-wimey, which I think, Dylan, you
Mhm.
must have appreciated, because you're a known time traveling, time bending fan, having brought many works involving time travel and time travel like stories to the table here on the show. Must have been a huge fan of. So it gets very, very ambitious and um, very challenging. And, that theme of perspective and understanding and stuff is super challenged to that as well. But having those multiple point of views and being able to use it as a device to maybe re-explain an idea or give more context to an idea to give the reader a fuller picture without giving the characters a fuller picture was super interesting and very impressive from like an author standpoint.
Yeah, I totally agree, Charles. I think ambitious is a great word for it. Definitely bites off a lot when it comes to the magical and fantastical elements of this book. Where if you think of the role of magic in, let's say, a, the like, let's say in Prince of Thorns, it's definitely on the like low fantasy side of things, and there's nothing super uh, potentially confusing that needs to like they needs to dive into there. If you think of the magic system in the Book of the Ancestor, it's kind of more a hard magic system to it. Like there's these, I think it's four like different classes sort
Mhm.
of people that have different powers, and then there's also other people who have kind of more like
Right.
mage type powers, and it's
And the
like, all right,
setting's an
we
ice
can,
planet where you can only live on the equator because that's where the sun shines through, you know, like
yeah,
that kind of
we
stuff.
can easily, yeah, easily digest that, and it's great to see Mark diving into something that is more ambitious, as you say. It's also the
Flexing his
book
muscles
has
too.
a, yeah, the book has a much more the phantasmagorical, like dreamlike.
Okay,
You like that word, Charles?
here we go.
It's yeah, yeah. It's got much more sort of like surrealist feel to
Hmm.
it than does any of Mark's previous work that I've read. Right, there is,
Fair.
especially like as we go further into this book, and I don't want to get into anything that'd be spoilery right now, but
Right.
uh, yeah, I don't know. It's interesting because there's kind of this like, yeah, surrealist is the world, not word, not to the extent of it not making sense. Like
Right.
I remember I watched a movie that maybe and some of you folks enjoyed, but I did not, called Mulholland Drive. I don't know if
Classic,
you
but
know that
I
one.
fall in the
It's
same
like,
realm as you a lot of with that. I think I know you're going.
yeah, right. That's like surrealist to the point where I'm like, none of this makes sense. And I'm so taken out of it that I don't care about the characters. I don't care about anything that's going on. Like Mulholland Drive completely lost me. And when people talk about why they enjoy it, like I had a friend who said, well, it's like being in a nightmare. It's like, I don't enjoy nightmares. Like, but they're like, it was so like all over the place. And like the not making sense of it is like unsettling in a way. I was like, that's not my thing. It's like the book that wouldn't burn gives you some of that like dreamlike feeling to it without straying into the this isn't making sense, and that goes
Right.
to the power of Mark, as you were describing, to oh, explain things without taking you out of
Right.
the character or what's actually
Right.
happening, which is
And
another
what's
delicate
interesting is
balance.
there's a lot we don't and the characters don't know about things like the library and how it works, and they're kind of guessing along just as we are. So somehow that still feels like they're testing, they're experimenting, they're coming up with theories on what's happening and on what's going on around them. So even though it could easily be this surreal, like, whoa, we're like, I'm in the present and the future and the past all at once. It's like it's like no, there's actually theories that they're drawing from, and they're coming to conclusions and they're figuring it out. You know, as much as the magic system is like loose and soft, it is being approached from a very hard analytical approach, and the things they can figure out, they try and build on and stuff like that. So something that very like it was well within Mark's kind of approach, Mr. Lawrence's approach
Dr.
to writing.
Lawrence.
Oh
Careful
yes,
there, Charles.
Doctor.
Oh,
Put
I
respect
insult
on
him.
the name there.
Yeah.
So no, yeah, that I'm not sure how much more I want to go into the spoiler free section, other than, you know what? Like, here's something I'll say in terms of like recommending it. Um, if you're familiar with Mark Lawrence's work and you like it, then you should definitely read it because it feels like a progression. It feels like a he's trying something new, he's growing out into something new, and that's, you know, if you're a fan of his previous works, to watch that development take place, highly recommended. And then I would say for people that haven't read his work, um, you still obviously should pick it up, but I'm wondering also if this should be your first entrance into the world or not. I think Mark would say, yeah, dive right in, let's go. But yeah, no, there's something to be said about reading his previous works first. But I think if you like, especially like if to me, there's so many sci-fi elements to this work and to his other works. Like if you like sci-fi as well as fantasy, but want to lean more fantasy, then give these books a try. Definitely the setting of the library should be a huge draw for you. Um, and not so much like your Game of Thrones, here's all the families dueling it out in a medieval type setting, but here's like a really interesting, scientifically driven element that's plopped into this fantasy world, and how do the characters exist with that. If that's something that interests you, I'd say go for it. I don't know, Dylan, what do you think when it comes to recommending this book? Who would you recommend this book to?
I would feel pretty comfortable recommending this book to pretty much anyone who's a fan of like the sci-fi fantasy genre. But in terms of like particularly if asked where should I start with Mark Lawrence, which kind of like that's what I was thinking about is we did that
Mm-hmm.
episode way back about where should I start with Brandon Sanderson, which I think is a
Interesting.
like yeah,
Valid
it's
question.
I thought, yeah, right. Where should I start with Mark Lawrence is a great question as well because his
Hmm.
books are so different from each other. And to give you some insight into our episode on where do you start with Brandon Sanderson, like we didn't just it's like an hour long. We weren't just like Mistborn. Thanks for
Although that's
listening. Rate
to
us five
summarize it,
stars.
yeah,
Oh
that's kind
yeah,
of
if you
the
had to summarize it. And I think like that's kind of a thing you can do with Mark's work as well, right? You can kind of say, hey, if you're okay with certain like content, like darker content that you get into in Prince of Thorns, if you're okay with that, then just you can say Prince of Thorns because it's his first book. It's a great book. You feel pretty confident.
Mhm.
I also think that, and I'll also say one more thing on the book that wouldn't burn to back up your point, Charles, would be there are, I can't get into any details in this part of the episode. There are
Right.
some tie-ins to previous works. And it might,
Right.
yeah, I mean, what I feel I can say is, God, I'm blanking on the word for the things that come before
Is
chapters
it
that are like,
epitaph?
that sounds right? Epitaph.
Worth a
Um,
Google, but
give that a
yeah,
Google,
it's more
but I'm
Easter
pretty
egg
sure
than
that's
anything
right.
else, but yes.
Yeah. So
That's what I was kind
there's
of dancing
yeah,
around before.
yeah. I mean, don't expect it's not, it's totally a book that you can dive into and completely
Oh, an
understand.
epitaph is when you died, an inscription on a tombstone. So it's not
Oh,
epitaph.
okay. Well, it's like isn't it like epigraph then? Isn't it, it sounds right.
It's something. Let me see. Let me try
What
epigraph.
go for it, Charles. We're embarrassing ourselves
Epigraph is a
by
short quotation or saying at the beginning of a book or chapter
it's
intended to
epigraph,
suggest
right?
its theme.
Okay.
Epigraph. Epitaph is
Right.
what's written on your tombstone.
It's like that old like etiology, etymology thing, right?
Yeah,
Like
right.
one's
So,
bugs and one's words, but and you'll get both of those in
ooh,
Mark
nice
Lawrence, the
seg.
book that
Yes.
wouldn't
And we're back.
burn.
We're back.
So giant bugs among the many fantastical features in the book that wouldn't burn, but I
Yeah,
would
people are loving
say,
mentions of cats and dogs and
oh
ravens and
yeah,
things. People are like, "There's this cute cat," and there is a cute cat in it. And we
cats
know
are
Mark
back in
Lawrence is
fantasy.
famous for having a huge cat, so I think that was definitely
Wobble.
Wobble. I think that was definitely inspired.
Yes, and if you want to know
Wonder if
how much
Wobble's
Wobble
getting
weighs,
royalties.
we asked him that in like an episode years ago, and
Right, we
when we
did.
wrote him some questions, and he wrote back. But uh, anyway, trying to say there are Easter eggs is a better word for it than or
Mm,
phrase for it than like tie-ins because uh, it's really mostly the epigraphs
mm.
that have these things in them, but you do appreciate it more, I think, if you've read his
And it
previous works. But
suggests that his works are somehow connected,
there is
which
a Lawrence verse. I won't
there
get
is a
into the
Lawrence
details,
verse,
but
right?
there's
So
certainly a Lawrence verse.
if you wanted to, like, it doesn't do anything to affect the story that you're reading. It makes it slightly more interesting, and it's fun for fans of Lawrence's work to to recognize those Easter eggs, but it shouldn't prevent you from if you really want to read Book That Wouldn't Burn, you're like, but do I have to read Prince of Thorns first? Like, no, if you want to
Definitely not.
read it, man. Like,
Yeah.
don't hold up, don't wait.
Yeah, and there's certainly people that I would recommend the book that wouldn't burn to before I would recommend uh, the other work, just based on, hey, what kind of themes would this
Sure,
person be interested in? And
graphic
especially if the
content.
person is someone who, yeah, and there's the graphic content and like Prince of Thorns that isn't as much in this one, which I think gets, for the record, like I do think Prince of Thorns gets like uh, treated more harshly than it actually is in terms of the graphic content. It's like if you can
Right.
read A Song of Ice and Fire, you can definitely
Oh,
read Prince of
yeah.
Thorns,
Oh,
which
yeah.
sometimes you'd think, based on what some people say, that's not the case, but
Yeah.
it's certainly the case.
I think Eorg is
Um,
just more in your face with it, even though way
sure.
worse stuff and more horrifying,
And you're in his
creatively
head.
graphic stuff happens in Game of Thrones. It still
The
is
first
Eorg is
person
like,
makes a big difference.
I'm gonna graphically kill this person because that's what I do. And then you're like, oh, that's makes me
Here I
mad.
go killing again. But
Here I
it's
go stabbing again.
I think that yeah, it's also the first person makes a big difference in how people
Yes.
react to the same
Yeah.
events.
Mhm.
But anyway, I think that you want to get a sense. I would say this is the book that leans closest to that capital L literature and its exploration of themes. And if that
Mhm.
is the kind of reader that someone is, I recommend this sooner than I would recommend his other work. But there's plenty of times I recommend the Book of the Ancestor. I actually think, like, of all of his work, Red Sister might be my favorite book of the whole
That
bunch.
might also be a good enough balance that it would be one of the more like widely accepted because
Mhm.
Prince of Thorns probably my one I would recommend first, but there is that graphic content nature. This one I would happily recommend too, but it also is asking a bit more in terms of understanding this what's going on. I think Red Sister's kind of somewhere in between the two, so it's a bit more widely easier to recommend.
Yeah.
That's an interesting
And
point.
there's also Impossible Times trilogy,
Which
which
is
is
on
like
my short list.
you gotta check it out, Charles. And that one gets really timey-wimey, I'll tell you that. And I think that I would recommend that one to I always recommend it to big fans of Stranger Things. Because
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, you love Stranger Things? You're gonna love Impossible Times because it's got, especially the first book, it's got a group of kids that play Dungeons and Dragons in a way that ties into the story, and it's also got kind of that like that same feel of the group of kids that are like taking on something very serious, but also like it's a little hijinky feeling because they're kids. Like
Mm.
it feels sort of those earlier seasons of Stranger Things vibes. But yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting question and one that we probably could do a whole episode on, the same way that we did with Brandon Sanderson's work. I know Mark, much like Brandon Sanderson, has a blog post somewhere that you can find. Somewhere you can find it on his website, I'm
Yeah.
sure, where he says where to start. And I think it kind of takes a similar approach where it's like, do you like this? Start with this book. Do you like
His
that?
blog
Start
is
with that book.
excellent, by the way. It's like him and Sanderson have two of like the best blogs in the game, where Mark Lawrence is very transparent about the advice he gives and like the details he goes into. It's really insightful stuff on there. And then also you get the Spiffbo stuff that he champions as well. So that's the self-published fantasy blog off that he like spearheads as well. So definitely worth checking that out too. Just a side note,
For
if you're gonna
sure.
bring up the blog.
Yeah. Check it out. I think if you haven't checked out the book that wouldn't burn, then that is a great thing to go do.
Mm,
And we wholeheartedly recommend it. And I
well
think
said.
with that, Charles, shall we give the non trademarked spoiler warning and get into with the time we do have left? Well, I guess we'll probably have to keep it pretty high level. Just looking at the clock over here, but
Right.
there's some stuff we definitely want to dive into for those looking for the deeper cut spoiler side and stuff that you and I should talk about because we haven't talked in depth about this book.
We have
Yeah, we
not.
saved it for the pod as we like to
Saved
do.
it for the pod. So yeah,
Yeah.
let's do it. Let's hear one of your famous patent pending, except not really, spoiler warnings, and we'll get right into it.
All right. If you haven't yet read The Book That Wouldn't Burn by Mark Lawrence, then we're going to talk about spoilers and a no holds barred conversation here. So now's a good time to turn this down in your headphones if you want to avoid spoilers.
Well said, Dylan. And here we
It's
are in
really
the
just
spoiler
like a
section.
filibuster, by the way, for like I just talk long enough where there's like full time for someone to like
Oh, for sure.
stop, like
I've been that
stop
guy,
doing the
like in my
dishes
car, like
and
listening
like
to the podcast, and someone being like, "Okay,"
right,
and like to skip the. I'm like, spoilers. I'm like, oh, like trying to like
right.
unlock the phone and also not drive into something. So
So I
I
try to
appreciate
yeah,
that.
go a little longer than I might go if I were just right. Because I could just say, all right, we're going to talk about spoilers now. But
Let's
you need
go.
the person
Yeah,
who's washing the dishes while they listen to a
dry their
podcast to be able to
hands.
like dry their hands and then click
Unlock the
pause.
phone, hit
Right.
pause, and even
Yeah.
doing this shtick now, we're giving that little bit of
Right.
extra entertainment while also prolonging it. So if someone's really like, man, I'm like,
My
elbow
hands are
deep
so
scrubbing this
wet.
pot right now. Yeah, I am not ready. Or, oh man, I left my phone in the other room and I got my AirPods on and I got to like get up and go over there. It's like, this is for you at this point because
Right.
we are ready to get into it. We gave the
We,
warning. There's nothing stopping us from diving into spoilers
right.
right now.
You could have pulled your car over. Just like nice and safe, like, you
I
know, and
My intrusive thought
just
is to scream out a spoiler right now, but I still feel the pressure of like I don't want
no,
to.
you can
I
scream it.
still we're in
You
it
can
now,
scream it.
we're
Just
in
scream
it.
it.
Okay, Elvar's a Saba. There you go.
Oh yeah, got him.
Sorry
Well,
if you didn't make it. We gave you plenty of time. Well,
is
yeah. I mean,
Ivar is
that's the
Ivar a
question, right?
Saba
That's
or
the
is
question.
Lavira Saba? Or
We're
are
all
we all Sabas
Sabas.
in a sense? Are we
Or
not
no
all
one's a
Sabas to
Saba. No
someone?
one's a Saba. If
No
in
one's a
the ideal
Saba, or
world.
we're all Sabas.
Mm, Well, we
Nice.
settled it. There we go. Thanks for listening. Yes,
Five
yes,
stars
that
on
is the
Spotify.
biggest. Yeah, 5 stars for sure.
Go for it. Yeah.
Spotify, go for it, and all that good stuff. Um, but that twist to me is the thing I think we just got to jump right into now in the spoiler section here about that revelation. And that also essentially kind of reveals a lot of the themes that Mark Lawrence is working on when he talks about all this knowledge and then like xenophobia and things like that. It all kind of pays off. What were your thoughts when you read this reveal that they were two different species and they didn't know it and built this romantic connection only to then be like, oh, we're each other's enemies? What was that like for you?
It definitely caught me off guard. I
Mm-hmm.
I knew there was something coming. I know
Mm-hmm.
I've
Right.
read enough of Mark's work. I knew we were going to get some sort of reveal that was
Mm-hmm.
going to be surprising, entertaining, and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
But I I was totally off with my guess. My guess was that Levira was going to, in some way, be like a past version of Clovis, who's the only woman who's in the library in like among Ivar's siblings, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they both have this past of oh, the Sabas killed my family and everyone, and now I hate them. And I'm like, huh, isn't that a weird coincidence that they both have the same backstory? And like, Ivar knows Clovis really well and has almost had some sort of like stuff resembling romantic attraction to Clovis and blah blah blah.
Right.
None of that panned out at all.
You were close. I mean, it
Was
was
I?
It was surprising to me too. There was some misdirection where, they meant there was the scene where Lavira and Ivar meet like the second time, and Lavira had her hair bleached by accident at one point in that chemical attack. And he was like, "Oh, your
Yeah.
hair." And I was like, okay, well, they obviously are seeing each other. But then they go on to do this thing of like, oh, we present sometimes what we are conscious about, and it can be perceived.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, like
That's
I
kind of
don't
the
get it,
magical,
but I'm
mystical
open to it. Yeah, you're right.
side
Exactly.
of that's kind of what I'm getting at when I was in the spoiler free section talking about like there's more of this dreamlike, and mystical would have been a good word to have used then because I just kept saying dreamlike. I was so thrown off by your reaction to the word phantasmagorical. I was like, I gotta
Kept thinking of
keep the
Mulholland Drive and
vocab
everything.
down. Yeah, but yeah, there's sort of this like, oh, let's go with it, mystical aspect to that. And I think that Mark's reveal that they're both Sabas to the other person is much better than what I had in mind because it actually
Oh
like
yeah.
helps drive home the themes, and or at least explore the themes, because it's like, oh, Lavira thinks she hates Sabas. Meanwhile, the person that she's like been kind of fawning over ends up being a Saba, and what does that mean,
Oh
and
yeah.
how do you adapt to that? And uh, I don't know. That's
Oh yeah. I
it's not
loved it.
just twist for twist's sake. It's twist for that's how you're
Right.
going to really get into
When you
this
think of like
discussion.
the good rom-com, right? There's like the meet cute where it's like, "Oh, I'm teleported into this mystical well in the library and you saved me." And then they
Typical
have the
rom
falling
com.
out.
It's
But the
always
falling
happening
out
just
is
like that.
usually like a miscommunication, like a misunderstanding that
Yeah.
could easily be fixed if they just talk to each other and you're rolling your eyes. But in this case, it's like, "Oh, I thought you were a different species," and like I don't like that species at all. And then you have to deal with that. It's almost like Beauty and the Beast, but instead of it being like, why is Belle even remotely attracted to what is obviously a horrific looking monster? It's like, oh, he looked like Prince Charming the whole time, but you the whole time you're actually singing and dancing with, the Beast character,
a,
and then you
a
have to
dog
like
person.
a dog person, a wolf dog monster thing, and you're like, oh, that is interesting because in the environment of the library, you can perceive them as Prince Charming, but like, does knowing the truth now affect like what you like feel about them? Because you know them for who they are. That's not being faked. Like you did fall in love with this person, their personality, their thoughts and opinions. Like you guys are genuinely connecting, but it's the physical appearance, the outside that was skewed by the library that they have to like kind of grapple with towards like almost pretty near the end of this book. It gets revealed, and they had to like deal with that relatively quickly. But Lavira's immediate instinct was, oh, that's horrible. And it's funny because when you think back, it's like there's that expression, oh, I'd sooner kiss a Saba or something. And
Oh,
it's like, well, you did unknowingly, but you did. So you think back on those times you said that, you're like, oh, it's kind of funny. Like to give you a sense of how turned off by the idea she was until she realized she's already done it, and like there's that
it's
kind
too
of
late.
revulsion, appulsion, like that she's grappling with too. It is a really interesting scenario to throw your characters in. Like, what would they do? How would they react? Can you survive something like that? Like, really thought provoking, challenging stuff. When I said that the relationship was challenging in our spoiler free section, I hope you guys now in the spoiler section appreciated that of like, hey, like this is a really tough situation that who knows what the right answer really is. You don't know what the characters are going to do at this point. I don't know what I would do if all of a sudden like my significant other turned out to be like a beast
A
like
wolf
monster.
person.
Yeah, a wolf person. I'd be like, oh, okay. I think it may be game over at that point, but is that just my bias, my
Wow.
xenophobia? I don't know. I don't know.
Well, luckily, there's zero chance that she's listening any to this episode at all, I would guess, let alone this deep into a spoiler section of this episode.
Right.
Your secret's safe with me and all of our listeners.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, of course. But uh, it's, yeah, first off, you can never unkiss a Sabbath. it's
Mhm.
over.
Oh,
You
yeah.
did
That's just the kind of person
it.
you are now,
Right.
you
Although with some of the timey-wimey stuff, who knows sometimes, but it's
True.
once you kiss the Sabbath, you cannot kiss them.
Yeah.
I think, yeah,
You could
it's
erase the moment where you did, but you're never going to forget. That's in your head
oh,
forever. Whether you undo the moment in the past or not, you still know. Even if it never
and we
happened, you
know.
still did it, because it's you remember it. Even if it never
Yeah,
actually happened because you went back in time and erased it.
yeah.
Interesting. That's a theme for you right there, Lawrence, if you're listening. That's kind of interesting.
Sure. I mean, yeah,
Do
that's
something with
a
that,
check.
write a best-selling book around
Do something with
that.
that.
Or I don't.
Good effort there, Charles. Yeah, challenging is a good word for it, and I love how you compared it to your typical rom-com. We
Mhm.
all know, like you said, the miscommunication trope, and it's great to see when relationship drama comes out of something that's actually unique and interesting. And it's hard to say this word about someone finding out their lover is a wolf person,
Mm.
but realistic. But, realistic in the sense that if it happened, then the reactions would genuinely cause like difficulties without each person having to like they call it pass the idiot ball around like
Mm. They do
having
call it
to
that.
yeah, having to be just a total bozo to not be able to work this out immediately. And props to Mark for doing that. He's had romantic relationships in past books, many that I've enjoyed, but this one, especially in Book of the Ancestor, but
Should we
this
call
one
this a
is
rom-com? I think it's not a comedy, but it follows the same formula
in some
for the
ways, yeah,
relationship.
I do see that. There is a
There is
meet
some
cute.
humor
There
in
is
this
a
book. There is humor.
Oh, for sure. There's always some humor in Mark's books.
This
It's
is
kind of through
as
the
close
lens
to a
of,
rom-com as we're gonna get for M. Law, Mark Lawrence,
I would agree, as opposed to J Law, who
as opposed to
probably has
J.
been in
Law.
quite her share of romantic comedies. I
Mm,
think that, yeah, I mean, the comedy is always like the characters themselves being funny rather than like the prose trying to be funny for the most part. There's a good
mhm.
line, I think, where like I was thinking about this when we are talking in the spoiler free section about uh, Ivar having all of this knowledge, but also like not really knowing anything.
Right.
He was talking about like the phrase came up like we're not in Kansas anymore, and he's like pontificating in his own mind about like, oh, some people think that Kansas was a real place, like others think it was like Atlantis or something, and
Right,
other
right.
people think it's more like a state of mind. And then it's like but Evar like agreed with those who thought it was a state, which is like hilarious.
Oh,
But
right,
like
yeah.
yeah, right.
A
I was
state
like,
of
oh,
mind
that's
versus a
right,
state of country.
exactly. But he
He's
said
done
like,
that
oh, I
before.
think
Like in
Kansas was a
Prince of
state.
Thorns, they would sing American Pie, but then like mumble, like some of the words got lost. So it was like instead of put the Chevy to the levee, it was just like a weird mumble of words. And like so I was like, oh, this is kind of funny. And now we could talk about the Lawrence first, right? Because we
Right.
kind of hinted at the Easter eggs and things, but we don't hear from York, we hear from his brother William, right? And then Mark Lawrence
Yeah.
himself. We got a few of these implications here that we exist somewhere in the late timeline, well after even Mark Lawrence, well after York. Although I think York takes place after Mark. Well, Mark Lawrence is the oldest, then William of Ancraft, and then what we've got in the library. Although depending
Although
on where
Mark is
you are in
still, of
time in the
course, a very
library,
young man,
oh, in his
and
prime.
a fresh, bright new voice in the genre,
Hmm.
despite having published books since, what did you say, 2011?
2011.
So then I think, yeah, the implication, I assume, is that all of these books could be found somewhere in the library, right? You could
Right.
find a Mark Lawrence book in the library.
Right. Prince of
Could
Thorns
you,
is in the library. William
right?
Ancraft's journals are in the library. Like
Yeah. And yeah, it's it's hard to get into the Lawrence verse too much without discussing spoilers from other books, which we always
That's
try to
fair. We
avoid.
should not
But
spoil
yeah,
others' books.
we can talk a little, maybe rather than being like, scholars of the Lawrence verse, we can talk a little more about our own personal reactions to it, which is kind of interesting. Which I remember you, because you were listening to the audiobook, you
Yeah.
texted me when you got to the part and you're like, did that say Will Ancraft?
Yeah.
Like, because
That's
I
I
can
was like,
imagine
what?
you like rewind using like the rewind 15 seconds and being like, that he's saying it like, or so that the woman who's the
Right,
narrator,
narrating
right?
it.
She's saying Ancraft, right? And it's, yeah, I think we still have a lot to see unfold in this trilogy around that, because like you mentioned, it kind of is reserved more to the Easter egg side of things, but I have a feeling it's going to emerge in the later books as a little bit
For
more,
sure.
not not like so central that you won't be able to enjoy the books as a trilogy on their own, but I think maybe a little bit more along the lines of like what Brandon Sanderson does in with the Cosmere, in where you're like, oh
Right.
whoa, like I don't think
It's
it'll be
not as
characters
explicitly
necessarily, but it's
stated.
like, oh whoa, I remember this from that other book, and it's actually playing a role in the story to
Right.
some extent.
Yeah, and
So
we're talking about the themes of this book, and you know, it's like the Guardians were talking about at the end of this book, where like, okay, this is all the world's knowledge. You think we would be able to give it to the humans and they would create a utopia, but every single time they just kill each other and forget and start over. So it's like, what do we do? Do we, is this knowledge a curse? Do we just like get rid of it and let people figure stuff out for themselves? Or is there a way to gift it to humanity where they won't just end up killing each other? You know, it's a very interesting, I would argue, sci-fi approach to the theme, because it's like, okay, we can teach someone how to build a gun. You think that would help them like advance technologically, but what if they just shoot each other? So it's like, okay, is knowledge before we're ready to receive it problematic? When are you ready to receive knowledge? What does it mean to receive or discover knowledge? Like, it's interesting questions, and the way he builds it into his Lawrence verse, it's not like Marvel, where all of a sudden Samuel Jackson's going to come in at the end and be like, I'm building a squad. It's no, they take place entirely separately, but because of the cyclical nature of humanity, like going scorched earth and trying to come back again, somehow through technology we're chronicling all of this in the library, but humanity doesn't understand it, so they just like inherit knowledge and technology in weird pieces, where it's like, okay, like I don't understand what Kansas is, but I know the phrase we're not in Kansas anymore, like. And then there's technological implications of figuring out certain things with technology, like guns is an example in this book, and there's other examples in other books that, to keep it fair to people that may have not read other Mark Lawrence books, I won't get into, but a lot of his settings have this super like technology influence to them, but they're always
mhm.
exactly like this, where it's like technology exists, but it's almost mystical in its existence. It may as well be magic to the people in the story, because they don't understand how circuits work and electricity works and like electric doors and computers and holograms and space travel. Like, it's all that's equally treated as the mystical stuff, which also happens in a lot of his books. And some of them have roots in some of the science stuff. So I feel like that's a sense of, it's more a universe in its theme than it is a universe in its storytelling, if that makes sense. It's the theme of like, hey, like the Prince of Thorns story can happen and all those characters can exist and live, and then we can just start all over. Like Mark Lawrence can exist, and then we can move past that. It's like we're not just building closer and closer to utopia, to the point where technology has made everything so much better that we're all wearing like silver jumpsuits and floating around like the Jetsons. It's no, it leads to this cyclical nature of abuse and destruction. Kind of a pessimistic view, but all characters hold out hope and are trying to figure it out. And that's the interesting. It's just such a Mark Lawrence thing to try and take in and understand. It's challenging in parts, but it's also like it's pretty poignant and thoughtful too. So that's what I get from
Definitely.
those Easter eggs in the Lawrence verse.
I like what you talk about with how Mark has the use of science as magic essentially
Mhm.
through the ignorance of the characters. It can be
Right.
perceived that way, things that are
Right.
mundane to us now. And it's fine. There's a Arthur C. Clarke quote, like author of 2001 A Space Odyssey.
Mhm.
And it's magic's just science that we don't understand yet. And no one's work
Mm,
in
well said.
contemporary fantasy better exemplifies that than Marx in like all the best
Mhm.
ways. And it's really interesting to see plays out really well in this book, and I'm sure it will in the rest of the series. I feel like the yeah, the setting of the library and the role that it like plays in the story, the parallels to the real world are really some of the coolest parts, right? The idea of
Right.
a burning library with all this knowledge, like that happened. The Library of Alexandria is still this famous thing about how we lost all of this knowledge, and it is this idea
Mhm.
of like losing tons of knowledge and trying to start over. Like it's played out, and you can probably read about that in the actual library of this fantasy novel because it has
Right.
all this information. And I
Mhm.
think, yeah, the we talked about this some in the spoiler free section. It's like the the idea of having almost too much knowledge is uh, it's like this is like a I could find a much better quote, I'm sure, to describe this, but this is the only one I can think of right now. And it's not deep at all, but it's like uh, in football, sometimes we'll say, if you got two quarterbacks, you have no quarterbacks. Because like you need one really good quarterback, not like
Right.
two that are competing for it. But it's like if you have too much knowledge, you almost have like no actual knowledge that you can have with certainty
Right.
in the way of like, if
And
anything, it lends itself to this like there's the king who is basically like just wants the library to be about, oh, there's books of so many different kinds that can support anything. Find me the books that support my own like
right.
propaganda and
Right.
use that.
And that's
And
the interesting thing about knowledge. It's like not like there's this responsibility that comes with receiving and understanding knowledge, right? Because what's interesting is you can just drop Wikipedia in the laps of some society, but like in this book, the nobility is kind of gatekeeping knowledge as a
right.
resource to control, and they're purposefully abusing it to stay in power in certain cases. And that's a really interesting piece to Mark Lawrence's themes across many of his works, is like, if you don't earn, or you're not responsible for the knowledge that you receive and it's just dropped in your lap, it's dangerous at that point because anything could happen, and people can abuse it, and things like that. So there is certainly that element of using it as a resource to control. When you have like, hey, here's all the knowledge of all of our futures and pasts, and like things that alternate universes, like we have literally everything, like Wikipedia, like interdimensional Wikipedia, like we've got it. You think we'd be able to, get people out of the dust and stop growing beans in the desert? No, they still do that. Like, I'm going to be king, and they're going to live out there in the dust, and I'm not really interested in helping them. I'm just trying to kill my enemies. So that's kind of the interesting other piece to that, is the responsibility of owning knowledge, and the role of the librarian and how political it becomes, and the exploration around that, and just trying to understand what's even going on. Is this a conspiracy? So that's,
Yeah.
a well explored theme. Not only of this book takes it as the focus, but he's been using it as a device for his whole universe of books. And I think this is the first book where he's really diving into the, like, that is the focus of my story and my themes. It's always been there, like in Prince of Thorns, even back in 2011, he was using these devices. But I think it's really come to the forefront here.
It has come to the forefront for sure. And I think that it's something that I've been thinking about is he's getting a lot, he's giving all of those things a lot of attention. He's exemplifying them through something like uh I remember there's a part where one of the epigraphs says like, oh, there's these books that describe the Sabas as having like their own technology and their own ability to like create a society, and like anyone with a brain could see that those are like basically complete fiction. um and obviously we find out that those are realistic, but it goes back to this like oh, those
Mhm.
who, right, we say knowledge is power, but and we usually mean that as very like positive, like educate yourself so you can do stuff. But
Right.
it's also like those who hold the knowledge hold the power, and those people are gonna see the Sabas as enemy, quite literally, and they don't want you to believe anything like that. There's also the like an interesting thing that is explored in here where fiction in the library is like extremely frowned upon. It's basically
Mm.
seen as a waste of time. And then I think Ute is the only one who basically uh, encourages that Levira at least read fiction and write fiction. And of course, her fiction writing ends up playing a pretty pivotal role in this story. And it
Mhm.
also is like it wraps the idea that Levere is writing these things about Ivar, and Ivar is then like those were his experiences, and also makes you think about like, so Mark Lawrence wrote all these things about Jorg, and now Mark Lawrence is real in the book theoretically,
Yeah.
and Jorg
And
is real
William?
in the book
Yeah.
theoretically. It's like
Right.
it raises a lot of questions, and I'm excited to see him get into as we move forward. But yeah,
Right.
fiction frowned upon in the story, which is interesting.
A bit tongue in cheek from Mark. And I read recently he submitted the third book in this trilogy to his editors already. So I think we're going to get a pretty steady release for these books as well. So we can rest easy that, we'll get the full story in the next couple years as he continues his regular release schedule, which mad props to that, especially in the fantasy genre. That can be a hard thing to do to release reliably, but it's well appreciated. And Lawrence Sanderson, those guys are like at the top of that game. So well respected. And I'm looking forward to seeing where that goes. Like you said, Dylan, he's opened up a whole can of worms, and even the ending of this book is really just like the kickoff of, hey, we're forming the squad, and here's the mission that we're gonna go on. And you're like, oh, okay, like let's see where this goes. Who knows? But the way Lawrence is taking on this grander stance of his whole universe and kind of revealing more of how that timey-wimey technology sharing aspect will actually work, where it's remained such a mystery for so long, I think will only build the notoriety for the series. And he's got some strong characters, and he's hitting hard with book one. So I'm looking forward to seeing where this goes.
Yeah, and I know where we will go, Charles, to the
Mm-hmm.
bookstores to pick up the next book in this series.
Oh, yeah. I absolutely agree. That's a future you can guarantee.
Nice. Uh, I think that, Charles, we're probably getting to the point here where we're significantly over that hour mark. We might have to make the this episode a part of the past before too long.
Yeah, well, it's already, a part of the past, but it's our future as well. So something to
Well,
consider out there for all you timey-wimey fans out there. You know what's also in our future and also our present is that sweet, sweet outro music. What do you say?
let's get that sweet, sweet outro music pumping in the present, Charles.
Here we go. Let's see
I
if
did know. I
there's
have noticed, like old school fantasy writers, like Tolkien. Tolkien loved using the word presently. Did you notice
He
that
did.
when
I
we like
did
read that?
notice
It's
that.
like,
I did
which
notice
is
that.
such a weird word,
Yeah.
presently,
He
because
used
it's
it
like,
a lot.
when would you need to say that? Like, if you just say it, then isn't it assumed that it's
Well, I think
presently?
Mark
Like,
Lawrence really needs to clarify, like, wait, where are we right now?
right. Well, Mark, yeah, Mark has enough stuff going on in the past and the future in a lot of his books that I guess presently would play a role, but
He's gonna have like a
he manages
Spaceballs
to.
moment where they're like, "Where are we? We're in the now. When? Yesterday? Now?" You know that scene from Spaceballs
Well,
where they,
yeah, it's well, who's on first,
yeah,
but I think,
exactly.
yeah, Mark somehow manages to. I don't think he used the word presently once, and he still makes it clear where we are in the timeline. While Tolkien, no time travel, needed to say presently, like,
Hmm.
I can only imagine how many times
Well,
in that
you
series.
can't argue with the results of the Lord of the Rings, so maybe that's that ingredient Mark's missing. You know, but maybe he needs to say
Well,
presently.
if
Yeah,
he
gotta
says
ask yourself.
presently a bit more, maybe all these books will be made into massive motion pictures directed by Peter Jackson.
Literary, some of the most famous works of fiction ever created, for over 50 years and still at the top of everyone's fantasy lists and this and that.
Hey,
Created a whole
we'll
genre,
see in 50
arguably.
years.
Yeah, we'll
Maybe
see in
these
50
will,
years.
yeah.
I'm feeling good for Mark's chances. So let's actually get that outro music pumping now. Since we already did the whole charade, I'm just going to hit play here.
Let's
Thank
do it
you
presently.
all. Let's do it presently, right now. Thank you all, one and all, for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. And if you think about it, Dylan, people listening to this episode later, where it's like, we've already played the outro music, but it's their present, our past, and someone actively listening to this beginning of the episode, it's their future. So it's all about perspective. You're not really like a wolf creature, are you? Because you have to tell me if you like describe yourself in the mirror, just so I'm clear. No, don't do that.
I think you more concerned about your partner, Charles. There was some.
No
I
concern.
figure if you find out I'm a wolf person, we'll probably still be friends, and
Oh,
we
we can
could
still
keep
record
recording the
episodes and
podcast.
stuff. Yeah,
I
yeah,
think it's
yeah.
more like your partner that you'd be worried
Yeah.
about
That
finding
would
that out.
be a bit more like troublesome, but we'll get there when we get there. For now, it's great. And
Things are
for
great.
thank you. Speaking
Neither
of
of you are
great,
wolf
you
people.
guys are great. The listeners for listening
Nice.
to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. If you like what you heard today, let us know over on social media. That's at the FTF Podcast on Instagram and at the FTF Podcast with a number 1 on the end for Twitter. Now, Dylan, if they like what they heard today and they want to support the show even more than engaging with us over on social media, what can they do?
Toss 5 stars to our podcast, which you can do over on Spotify. Just 2 clicks over at the top of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast feed, and it helps us so much when you do that. You can also leave a 5-star rating and or review on Apple Podcasts. And anytime we see those, it puts a smile on my face and presumably on Charles's face as well. But just listening is more than enough. Thank you so much for doing that.
Yes, just listening more than enough. Dylan, rest assured, a smile is on my face just thinking about all those wonderful listeners. Thank you all so much for making it to the end. We greatly appreciate it. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.